So last week, we finished up chapter 44 of Genesis, and we actually went into the first two verses of chapter 45, where Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. Now, if you remember, what happened was that Judah came forward, and he finally said that instead of Joseph taking Benjamin as a slave, he was willing to sacrifice himself. And he said, take me instead, because if you don't, my dad will die of sorrow. And it showed the real change of heart that his brothers had, exemplifying in the person of Judah, really saying, we're willing to take the punishment. I'm specifically willing to take the punishment and to save my brother, which is a complete change from just a few chapters back when they sold Joseph because they hated him so much. And so in chapter 45, we'll start off in verse 1 again. It says, Then Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him and cried out, Make everyone go out from me. So no one stood with him while Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, Please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and a lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. So when Joseph recognized the change in their heart, he was finally convinced all of his tests were done, and he sees the change in his brothers. He tells them he's overcome with emotion, has all the Egyptians leave, so it's just him and his brothers there. And he reveals himself and he says, I'm Joseph, does my father still live? And the brothers looked at him like, you're who? Say that again? Because remember, he's been talking to them through an interpreter. Now all of a sudden he's speaking their language. Because they're alone, he has to be speaking their language. So all of a sudden he says, I am Joseph, who you sold into Egypt. Is my father still alive? And they're so surprised, and it caught them so off guard that they just kind of stand there dumbfounded, and they're saying, what? Who are you? Surely not. Did you say Joseph? Because they've never named Joseph. They always keep saying, one is no more. One is no more. And he says, I am that one. I am more. I'm right here. And so they're all dismayed. And he says to them, come here. Come close. Because remember, he's royalty at this point. They're not allowed within a certain distance, and they know that. Even though all the Egyptians left, it's just him and his brothers, they're not about to come near him. And so he has to call them. He says, come closer. I want to talk to you. And so they come closer to him, and he says, please listen to me. So they came near, and he says, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But don't be grieved, don't be upset with yourself that you sent me here, because it was all part of God's plan. Now, what is Joseph known for? He's known for interpreting the will of God through dreams. I'm sure throughout all this time that he's been in the Egyptian court. Whenever they raised him up, he started thinking back to his dreams. And he says, well, I remember dreams where my family bowed down to me. And he says, now wait a minute. Why would they come up here and bow down to? Well, wait a minute. We're about to go into a major famine for 7 years. Remember that no one outside of Egypt knew how long that famine was going to last. It was just because of Joseph. Everyone else just knew there's a famine. When is this ever going to end? And so his brothers, and so I can imagine during those 7 years of prosperity and that 7 years of plenty and everything, Joseph is going, they're going to come. I don't know when. I don't know how long it's going to take them. How many years into the famine it's going to take my stubborn family to get up here. Or get down here, technically. He says, but eventually they're going to come. Why? Because this is all part of God's plan. And he had those years of prosperity to understand and to start analyzing his own dreams and start thinking, going, you know what, they tried to harm me by selling me here. But in reality, it wasn't them who sent me here. This was God. He's the one that's taking care of me. He's the one that sent me here. He let them sell me down here as a slave so that I could rise to the position I'm at now to save the life of my family. That's what's going on. So whenever they finally do come, he puts them through tests. Have you really changed? Have you really changed? God put me in this position. God put this whole thing together. But have you really changed? Or are you the same evil little brothers, or evil brothers, not little, evil older brothers that sold me away into slavery? And so he puts them through these tests, and whenever he's finally convinced, he's overcome with emotion that they've changed. And so he tells them, I'm your brother. Don't be grieved because you didn't actually send me here. You meant it for harm, but God meant it for good, that I can save your life. And it's an amazing character trait of Joseph when we start thinking about this, because in our human minds, what do we say we would do? Someone who wanted to kill you ended up selling you as a slave. You've been a slave you spent, 10 years in prison? For no reason? And now all of a sudden you have all the authority, and you could literally have your brothers executed. What would you do? Joseph is an amazing character, and this is why he is a type of Christ in the Old Testament. He exemplifies Christ's behavior and Christ's desire, because he doesn't seek revenge on those who harmed him. I mean, what did Jesus say when he was literally being nailed to a cross? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Whereas in our human minds, we're like, Father, strike them dead now, because I don't like this. And so he says, you didn't send us. God sent me here to preserve your life. He said, for there are still 5 years where there's not going to be planting or sowing. This is the first the brothers have heard about this. And so I'm sure they're going, 5 years? How does he know this? How does he know? You know, they're very dismayed. And he said, God sent me before you to preserve a prosperity for you in the earth and save your lives by great deliverance. So it was not you who sent me here. It was God. Joseph has made peace with himself. Sometimes whenever bad things happen to us, we need to have peace, make peace with ourselves and with God, and realize that things may have been caused by certain people in your life, but God is the one directing where you walk. That's why it says, where is it in the Proverbs? In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. He will direct them. All you got to do is acknowledge God in every way you go. What does that mean? Let him lead you. And it may seem that you're going into a place of trial and problems, but God is directing your path, and he has a plan for where you're going, not just where you are. And so he says, and he has made me a father of Pharaoh, a lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. It almost makes it sound like he just kind of wanted to throw that in there. Remember those dreams that you guys said, we'll never bow down to you? Guess what? You've done it to us. You've done it twice. It's already happened. God has made me a ruler. And in verse 9, Joseph continues. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus saith your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, your flocks and your herds and all that you have. There I will provide for you, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty, for there are still 5 years of famine. So he says, go to my father, go back to the land of Canaan, tell him you need to come down to Egypt. Thus saith Joseph your son, you need to come down. God has made me Lord of all Egypt and a father to Pharaoh. And in verse 12 he says, and behold, your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my mouth that speaks to you. So you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. Moreover, he kissed all his brothers and wept over them, and after that his brothers talked with him. They're still standing there like, what? Joseph? And as he's talking, it's finally starting to make sense. And it's finally starting to click with them. And they're getting over their initial shock, and they're seeing how God has brought this all about. And I'm sure many of them are thinking, I remember those dreams that Joseph always talked about, us bowing down to him. We have done that. And so this really is Joseph. He was not only telling Joseph what was going to happen, he was using Joseph to tell his family what was going to happen, so that when it did, they would believe it was actually Joseph. Because if they hadn't known about the dream, and then this happened, they would be going, you're a con man. There's no way you're Joseph. But he told them it was going to happen many years before they even sold him into slavery. And so it's this whole turn of events. And so they finally realize that. He greets them. He cries with them. He's hugging them. And they finally accept it. And they start talking to him. Oh my gosh. Tell us about it. No, don't tell us about it. How did you get to this position? We understand how you got into prison. You don't need to cover that. And so he's in there talking with them. And then in verse 16 it says, now the report of it was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brothers have come. So it pleased Pharaoh and all his servants well. So it kind of shows you that servants never really leave. They're eavesdropping. They're right off to the side. They heard it and they're like, oh, that's his brother. His brothers. Oh my goodness. So it was heard in among the servants and Pharaoh's, and it says it pleased them well. And in verse 17 it says, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, say to your brothers, do this, load your animals and depart, go to the land of Canaan. Bring your father and your households and come to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you will eat of the fat of the land. Now you are commanded, do this. Take carts out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and your wives, and bring your father and come. Also do not be concerned about your goods, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours. Remember, Pharaoh at this point views Joseph probably almost as a deity. He probably sees him almost as a god. I mean, after all, he says the Spirit of God is in you. So Joseph's family, yeah, they're going to get special treatment. And Pharaoh says, this is great. He says, tell your family, bring your father down. Go get your households, go get everything you have, come down, I will put you in the best place in the country of Egypt, the land of Goshen, the territory of Goshen. He says, you'll live there, you'll eat of the fat of the land, don't even worry about bringing your stuff, just come yourself. You can leave all your junk over there, right? Of course, they weren't about to do that because they wanted to keep their stuff. But he says, bring your families, your households, everything, come down. You will eat of the fat of the land. You will be taken care of by me personally. Joseph has saved not only my household, but the entire nation of Egypt. Trust me, his household will be taken care of. He even says, take some carts. That way your children and your wives don't even have to walk. You can just roll them all along. right? Take some wagons. Verse 21 says, Then the sons of Israel did so. And Joseph gave them carts according to the command of Pharaoh. And he gave them provisions for the journey. And he gave to all of them, to each man, changes of garments. But to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of garments. And he sent to his father these things: 10 donkeys loaded with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain, bread, and food for his father for the journey. So he sent his brothers away, and they departed, and he said to them, See that you do not become troubled along the way. Now, we often think, and at the end of the book of Genesis, or here in a little bit, it'll tell you how many people of Joseph's household came. And it's a total of about 75 people, right? We know that. So why would he send so much food for the journey? Because they had servants, and they still had that massive household. 20 donkeys worth of food. I always looked at that and went, you know, as a child, I'd read that, or as a youth, and I would go, why did he send so much stuff just to bring it right back? Because it makes it sound later on like there's just 75 people. You don't need 20 donkeys worth of food for a week journey. Whenever you're talking about 75 people. Well, whenever you're talking about those were the men of the household, they had their wives, they had all their servants, they had all their animals, they had a big household. They were all coming down. This wasn't a small procession. This was a massive household coming to live within the territory of Egypt. And whenever you start to realize that, you start to also understand why in later generations, it says in the book of, at the beginning of the book of Exodus, there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and they were afraid of the Hebrews. Because this was a combining of 2 nations. It wasn't just a household. It was a nation coming down. And so 20 donkeys worth of food, grain, and the best things of Egypt just to bring the household down. That's a lot of provisions for that journey. And of course, Joseph says, don't become troubled on the way. Can you imagine this procession going up into Canaan? Can you imagine the fact that there's been a famine for 2 years and someone sees 20 donkeys worth of food going up? You can imagine that the people standing by were going, you know, if we attack them, we can get 1 donkey. But it doesn't happen. God's provision includes people being afraid to attack. And so they go up to get their father. And in verse 25 it says, Then they went up out of Egypt and came to the land of Canaan to Jacob their father. And they told him, saying, Joseph is still alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart stood still, because he did not believe them. But when they told him all the words which Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. Then Israel said, It is enough. Joseph my son is still alive. I will go and see him before I die. He never thought it possible. He thought he was going to be sad until he was buried, because Joseph was gone. He was still carrying around that depression. And then they come to him and say, Joseph is alive. And he goes, I don't believe you. Where has he been for the last 20 years? I don't believe you. And they said, but he is. He's governor over the entire land. He rules Egypt. He's the one that sold us the bread the first time. He's the one that spoke harshly to us. He's the one that put Simeon in jail while we sat here. He's the one who brought him back out. Look at these garments he gave us. And Benjamin's like, let me put on a little fashion show for you, because I got 5 of them. Everyone else just got 1. And also notice I have a big money belt now. you know? And so and Jacob is sitting there going, I don't believe you. And then he starts hearing these words. And they said, and he sent us carts so that you don't have to walk. And he looks out there and he sees all the carts, not just enough for him, but for him, all the children, and all the females. That's a lot of carts. We're not talking about just one or two carts. That was a lot of wagons. So he looks out and he sees the procession of wagons and he goes, they have to be telling the truth. Look at everything that was sent. And he tells them, and they're still trying to convince him, and finally he goes, it's enough. Joseph, my son, is alive. I will go and see him before I die. The patriarchs were always fatalistic. I mean, think about Isaac. You know, he was like, go hunt me some game, Esau, so that I can bless you before I die. It's like 30 years later that he finally dies. So it's not like it happened right away. But Jacob is a little bit the same way. He says, I will go and see him before I die. I don't know when I'm going to die. I'm old, and he is old at this point. He says, I'll go and see my son before I die. His spirit revived within him. He says, everyone pack up. They have not moved. Did you ever notice that? Since they left Shechem, when Reuben and Simeon wiped out the males of the city of Shechem, and they plundered it, they moved to this spot, and they have not moved since. So they've got a pretty permanent dwelling at the moment. And now all of a sudden Jacob says, it's enough. We're going to see my son. Everyone start packing, because we're going to leave. And that's where we pause for the moment. It's always hard to break up a story. But, you know, we can't do it all in one week. It would take a week. But it's amazing to watch Joseph's behavior and his graciousness towards his brothers and his love for his family, even when they treated him so badly. And we just look at that and we say, God, help us to be more like that. We need to have more grace. We need to start understanding that even whenever we go into bad places and bad times in our life, even though other people had a hand in that, it might be God sending you there for a specific reason, even though it's hard. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you for all you've done. Thank you for your blessings. Thank you for showing us examples of godly men who followed you that closely and even are perfect examples of what you want us to be like. Father, I pray that you would change our hearts. Help us to be more like you, as Joseph was. Lord, help us to see things in a different light. Help us to see things through your eyes, so that although people may have a part in the situation in our lives, we know that you are the one taking us from place to place. And you have a plan not only for where we are, but for where we're going to be. Lord, and help us to be submissive to your plan and be able to do the things that you want us to do. Father, I pray that you would take us from here, that you would protect us and keep us all week long. Lord, help us to be good witnesses everywhere we go and in everything we do, and bring us back safely next week to learn more about you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.